Welcome to a beginner's intro to Kerbal Space Program. In this series, we're learning the absolute basics of Kerbal Space Program from the point of view of a complete beginner trying out the game for the first time. Let's dive into Episode 1. Welcome to Kerbal Space Program. In this first episode, we're going to be taking a look at starting a new career save from the point of view of an absolute beginner who doesn't really have any experience with the game, but is interested in getting started. We're going to go through the options for setting up your save and take you through the process of learning your way around the user interface and launching our first rocket. Alright, so first we're going to start game. And we're going to do a new save. We're going to call this Career Mode. And we're going to take a look at the difficulty options. So the vast majority of these difficulty options you're going to want to leave as they are as the default for your first game. There are only a couple of things that we're going to play with in here. First thing, we're going to allow other launch sites. What this will allow us to do is to use a couple of other launch sites that are around the planet to launch our rockets from. So that can come in handy later. And also, we're going to come over here on the bottom right and turn this decline penalty to 0. What that does is it allows us to decline mission contracts without any penalty for doing so. Early on in the game, that doesn't make a lot of a difference. But once you get later into the game and you decide that you want to decline missions that don't really give meaningful rewards or that you've done 100 times and it's going to be boring or would just be tedious, those penalties for throwing those missions away can really add up. So we're going to leave that to off. Going into advanced, there's nothing in here that we're going to play with on our first save. But if you really want to ramp up the difficulty, you can turn on some of these other options like pressure limits and G-force limits and plasma blackout and all that. But we're not really interested in getting crazy with the difficulty right now, so almost all of this is going to remain at default, and we're going to hit accept. But one thing that you might want to do, I'm not going to do it here, but you can change your starting funds, and you might want to crank that up a little bit. On your very first game, but I'm not going to for these tutorials. Now, the next thing you have to do is you're going to want to pick a flag, clicking over here. I have a whole bunch of extra flags installed, including some that I've made myself. So we're just going to pick a flag here, because picking a cool-looking flag is super important. So I'm just going to go with my channel logo, and then we're going to start. Okay, so here we are on the main screen after it loads. This is the Kerbal Space Center. Now, this is our basic launch site that we start with and all of our facilities. If you played around in the sandbox, you're going to notice this looks a bit different. These buildings are different, the runway's different. That's normal. There are 3 levels of upgrades for each building. And in the career mode, we start off with everything at level 1. If you do the sandbox mode, everything is fully upgraded. So the graphics look a little different. Here's this guy, Gene Kerman, giving us a little welcome. That's fine. So the first thing we're going to do is go through these buildings and talk about what they are. The administration building, here on the left side, this is used for setting what are called strategies. In the early game, these don't really come into play very frequently, but in the later game they can become a big deal. The long story short is that you can tweak your mission rewards so that, for example, you get less money but more science. So that's the super oversimplified version of that. The astronaut complex is where we hire and train additional crew members. The flagpole allows us to pick a new flag if we wanted to. The launch pad is where we launch rockets from. If you click on that, we don't have anything saved for, like, pre-made rockets or anything. But after you have missions and rockets assembled, you can click directly on the launch pad to pick one and launch it. Mission control is where we pick our mission contracts. You can see here it says active contracts 0, maximum of 2. When you upgrade this facility, you get a higher maximum of contracts. So for right now, we're going to pick 2 of them. We're going to do gather scientific data from Kerbin, and we're going to click over here to accept it. And you notice here it's got some rewards if we complete it, and we also get an advance of 2,240 funds, our money. And then we're going to do launch our first vessel. Again, we get a little bit of an advance, and we get some money, science, and prestige for completing it. Next up is our Research and Development Center. This is where we research our technologies. If you click on one of these technologies that's light gray, it means that this is one we can research. Over here, it shows you how many points you need and the parts you would get from researching it. These darker gray ones we don't have unlocked yet. We don't have the ability to get them unlocked because, as you can see down here, it has prerequisites that we haven't yet discovered. The runway is just like the launch pad, but for planes. The space plane hangar is going to be just like the vehicle assembly building, but for planes. The tracking station is an important building. If you have active missions that are like out flying around doing stuff, or you've got a satellite around a planet or something, the tracking station is how you would switch to control one of those missions that's already in progress. Or if you have something that's landed back on your home planet and you want to recover it, there'll be a button down here to recover. Or if you have a mission that you want to abandon and just forget about it, there'll be an option down here to close out that mission. Now into where some of the main action is. The vehicle assembly building. This is where we actually construct our rockets, and we're going to go through the interface here really quickly. But before we do that, actually, let's go back to the Space Center. I want to show 1 or 2 other things on the interface. Up here on the left is your time bar. This shows how quickly time is proceeding. If I ramp this up, you can see the day-night cycle is going to go through. You can also click this button here to take you directly to the next morning. So that can be important if you want to like launch a rocket at night or during the day, that sort of a thing. Up here in the center, you have three indicators. The left one is your current amount of money. It's just called funds. The middle one is your reputation. You can see it's green. We have a good reputation. Having a good reputation is done by like completing missions and stuff. And having good reputation will allow you to get better missions later on in the game. If your reputation starts to suck, you're going to get like really crummy mission contracts that are extremely difficult to complete and have bad rewards. And the blue thing, the blue number with the little atomic symbol, is your science. Now down here in the lower right, we have a messages window. This is going to give us information about like world records we've set, like if we set an altitude record for one of our rockets, or if we've completed some missions, things like that. The next one is an alarm clock. We can actually set alarms that'll pop up and remind us. For example, if we're launching a probe to another planet, we can set one of these alarms to remind us when our probe reaches the other planet so that we can multitask and we don't have to just sit there and watch it the whole time. This little window shows us our active contracts, and if some of the contracts have like multiple goals, it'll show us in green what we've completed and what we haven't. And this one is your KSpedia. This is like an in-game instruction manual if you have questions about stuff. These three over here, everything to the left of this little like caution bar, are buttons that are placed here by mods. Now, in this save, I'm not running any gameplay mods. The only mods that I'm running are some graphic enhancements. I'm running a mod, for example, that adds some of those nice looking clouds and changes like the water reflection texture and stuff like that. It's purely cosmetic. So if your screen looks slightly different than mine, that's why. But none of those mods I'm running there change the gameplay at all. Alright, so let's go back into our vehicle assembly building. Now, the first thing to understand is how the interface in here works. You're going to notice we got some of those familiar buttons down at the bottom. That's good. We also have this thing down in the lower right, which is our staging indicator. Here in the lower left, we have our amount of money, and we also have an indicator of how much it'll cost to launch the current rocket. So you see I just added this part, the Mark 1 command pod, that costs 600, and you can see it costs 635. The reason it cost a little bit more than the base cost is if we right click on it, we can see some extended stats. This particular one carries what's called monopropellant, which is compressed gas that's used for like RCS maneuvering thrusters in space, and it's not free. So that's where you get a little bit of extra cost. All right, so we're going to click out of that. Oop. There. And of course, obviously, you can click on something and move it around. Over here on the left are the different categories of parts. Most of these are going to be empty at the start of the game because we don't have very much unlocked. But for example, here in aerodynamics, here's a fin. We can put like stability fins on something. In the structural, we can add some girders. And your plus and minus keys on the keyboard will zoom. One important thing to notice is that when you click on a part and you have something selected for movement or placement, you get those green circles that are visible, those spheres. Those are attachment nodes. So when you line up there, it'll snap. Whereas if you don't line up, it'll just kind of stick itself to wherever. So those are extremely important for vehicle construction. And here I'm just going to remove these parts. I'm just going to click on them to move it around and hit the delete key. So again, all these different categories of stuff. Most of them are going to be pretty empty at the start of the game. But what we're going to do for our first vessel, we're going to do a parachute, because that's very important. We're going to go into science and do goo experiment. And we're going to go into engines and pick our solid rocket booster right there, just a little junior guy. Now, here on the upper left, you're going to see a couple of different like editing modes. The default one is your placement tool, which is where you click on something and you attach it to your vehicle. Next is the movement tool. This is useful and important, especially for parts clipping. Like you can see this goo experiment sticking off the side of our rocket. That looks kind of weird sticking out there. It looks like a tank or something. So we can click on that and use these three arrows that come up and reposition that so it clips into the side of the vehicle. Now, if you look down here in the bottom left, you're going to see there's a little symmetry thing and a snap. If we toggle the snap, it'll allow us to do very fine granular adjustments, versus if we turn the snap back on, it'll snap it to some presets. So that's the deal with that. We also have the rotate tool, which is for rotating parts, and a reroute, which comes into play once you have struts, and that's something that we're going to cover at a later point. Now, this is our basic rocket, but if we launch this right now, it's not going to work. The parachute's going to go off at the same time the rocket launches. How do I know that? Well, down here in the bottom right, we have what are called our stages. So here we have one rocket stage, so when we activate the rocket, it's going to launch and fire this green solid rocket booster, and it's going to activate this parachute. So I want to add a second stage. I'm going to hit plus, and I'm going to drag the solid rocket booster down into that. Now I realize that this says stage 0, stage 1. For whatever reason, these are labeled kind of backwards. When you're designing a rocket, the stage that is at the bottom of this little row, and as you can imagine, if you get bigger rockets, this can become quite a list. The ones that are on the bottom will activate first. So that's the deal with that. So now, when I launch this rocket, which we're going to do right now, first we're going to name it Rocket 1, and then we'll save it, and then we'll launch it. Now, when we go to launch this rocket, you're going to see here on our main gameplay display, again on the left, is our staging indicator showing that we've got the solid rocket booster and the parachute. When I hit my staging button, which is the space bar by default, it's going to fire off the solid rocket booster. Then if I hit it a second time, it'll deploy the parachute. Now, a few other things to look at on this main screen before we get started. Down here on the very bottom left is your mode indicator, if you're in docking mode or not. You've also got controls for toggling your map and some other stuff that isn't really like maneuver nodes that's not going to come into play just yet. And display staging, you almost always want to leave that displayed. Over here, we again have our time bar. We can use that to fast forward if we want to. And we have some important displays up here. The little icon of your Kerbal in the spacesuit shows that the fact that it's green shows that we have a crew member inside of here, displayed on the lower right, Jebediah Kerman. He is in the pod and controlling the rocket manually. Next is our signal strength for communication. Our data RX, we cannot transmit science back to base because we don't have a radio antenna. So that's something to be aware of. And direct connection to Space Center is currently white instead of green because, again, we don't have an antenna, so we don't have a direct connection. That becomes important when we get into like unmanned satellites and things like that, when you're controlling a probe that's out around some other planet. Up here on the top, you have your altitude indicator, and the little 3 water things shows that you're above sea level. We're 69 meters above sea level. We can click that to make it above ground level. We are 2 meters above ground level. And you can also take a look here and see your ascent speed, your vertical speed, your atmospheric pressure indicator, turning your lights on or off. If we use our mouse wheel to zoom in, you can see that that turns the light on and off. Gear action group. If we had any sort of landing gear or landing legs, this would deploy them. And brakes. If we had wheels with brakes, that would toggle the brakes. Up here in the lower right, we have the messages again. We have the resources tab, and this is the one that I leave open most of the time. You can leave it up just by clicking on it, and this will show you the amount of all of your resources. In this case, solid fuel, monopropellant, and electric charge. The solid fuel is pretty obvious. It's how much fuel is left in our rocket booster. The monopropellant is how much of that compressed gas we have left if we had little RCS boosters for steering ourselves off in space. And electric charge is an indication of our batteries. That becomes very important because without electric charge, there's not a lot that you can do. So you always want to make sure that you either bring a lot of batteries, or once we get further into the research tree, we have solar panels or radioisotope thermoelectric generators. Next, you can do your alarm clock again, the contracts again. This shows us what our active contracts are. This tab is just the display of our main career resources, our money, reputation, and science. Our Delta V budget, and we'll talk about that at a later point. If we had cargo, we could look at it here, but really we're just showing that Jebediah Kerman has a parachute and an EVA jetpack. And the KSpedia again, if we wanted to look around the manual. The bottom right shows our crew members. If we hit EVA, your guy will climb out and you can move them around. There's not really much to do in our first little thing here. However, before we launch, one of our contracts is gather scientific data from Kerbin. So let's do that. If we right-click on our command pod, we can do a crew report, and we'll go through all the rest of this at a later point. You'll kind of pick up on what all these do over time. Most of them are pretty obvious, but the one we care about right now is crew report, which is a scientific experiment, and we're recording the crew's assessment of the situation. Really, our guy's just sort of writing down, I'm sitting on the launch pad, and we're going to keep experiment. The other option is to reset or to transmit. Now, we don't have the radio link back to the Space Center, so we can't transmit. So we're just going to keep. And we're going to do the same thing on the goo experiment. Now, something to notice here. You notice recovery, we get 6 science. and it shows this green bar. For transmit, we only get 1.3. So this shows us that the goo experiment, if we just send the results back by radio to the command center, we're going to get a very small amount of science from it. However, if we bring the experiment with us back to the Space Center physically, like when we complete the mission and recover our vessel, we get a bunch more. So when you have the choice, it's usually advantageous to do it that way. And we're ready to go. Now I'm going to go back to my resources tab, and you can see, ooh, I got a message, world first milestone. We have performed an EVA test at home. So here we got a point of reputation and some money because we climbed out of our space capsule and looked around. So not a really significant achievement, but it's the first time we've done that. Now this is a solid rocket booster, so down here on the bottom, this throttle control on the left isn't really going to do much. I usually have my throttle all the way at max at launch as a force of habit, but with a solid rocket booster, it's either on or it's off. This option here is your RCS, toggled by the R key on the keyboard. It'll turn on or off your reaction control system, and we don't have one, so it's not going to do anything with this rocket. This next one is your stability assist. This is extremely important as it uses a computer guidance assistant, or if you have a pilot in your vessel, your guy will do it manually, to keep your rocket steered in the direction you're trying to point it. So that's a very important thing to have. And this blue thing here is your artificial horizon indicator. When we launch, it'll become immediately obvious what this does if you've never seen this instrument before. And you can also hide that if you don't want it there, but I think you probably do. So let's launch. We're going to hit spacebar to activate our first stage, and our rocket goes up. And if we use the WASD keys to steer a little bit, you're going to see what this artificial horizon indicator does. Now, the way I was able to steer is that the command pod has a gyroscope inside of it, what's called a reaction wheel. So we can turn that on or off by toggling torque. So here I turned the torque off, and now I can't steer it. But if I turn the torque on, I can steer it again. You're also going to notice up here in the corner, on the upper right, that steering the rocket around costs electricity. So, got to be careful with that. Also, having the stability assist on costs electricity, but without it, we are completely at the mercy of aerodynamics. So, something to be aware of. Now, the way to read this display, this little green circle shows the direction we're traveling. So you can see here, it's going to show us we are now traveling straight down. This slightly different looking one, with the 3 prongs and the X through the middle, shows us the opposite direction to where we're traveling. So down here in the bottom left, the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to hit spacebar again to stage into our parachute. But if we right-click on our parachute, you're going to see that there's a minimum atmospheric pressure to open, an altitude at which it will open, and we can change that if we wanted to, and a spread angle, which you don't need to worry about for right now. So we're going to hit spacebar and deploy our parachute, and use the mouse wheel to scroll out just to see. Out goes our parachute. Now, with the parachute out, I can turn off the stability assist, because the parachute is going to provide some aerodynamic drag and make sure that we're kind of pointed up and down correctly once we get low enough. So we'll wait just a moment for that to open. And as you can see, when we get down to the 1,000 meters, it deploys fully, and it slows us down so that we can land. Now here's a situation where we can use our time bar in the upper left to speed up, because we're going down real slow and we don't necessarily at the moment want to watch that whole descent. And so we've landed. Excellent. Now I'm thinking, ooh, look at that. In messages, we have some world first milestones. We've done all this stuff for the first time and set a bunch of records. Look at all that money we got. So that was good. We also achieved the contract, launch our first vessel. So we got some rewards from that. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. And that shows us that we completed the contract. This shows us that we completed the parameter of the contract, the requirement of it. Now, we don't yet have gather scientific data from Kerbal completed. Why is that? Well, we haven't actually recovered this capsule yet. Now, we don't get any of that science that we have stored in there until we recover the capsule. And this is something that a lot of new players miss because it's hidden by default in the interface. If you move the mouse up to the top center of the screen, it'll show you these two hidden buttons. You can go back to the Space Center, leaving this capsule where it is, or you can recover it. So we're going to recover it. That'll automatically send out crews to recover the vessel, bring it back to our Space Center. It'll recover the crew member from it, and it'll recover all of the science experiments we have inside. You can see here these different science experiments we got for a total of 9.5, bringing our total overall to 21. This display's rounded down. You can see up in the top it's actually 21.5. Parts shows us parts that we've recovered. Things that you recover, you can recoup some of the costs from, so that can become important over time. And this shows our crew. Our guy, Jebediah Kerman, gained an experience point, so that's good. So we're done with that view. Now we can look here in messages. As you can imagine, this list can get pretty cluttered over time, so you just hit delete all messages to clear that out. And if we look in contracts, we gathered scientific data from Kerbal and completed that. Now, if we go into mission control, you can see there's a whole bunch of additional contracts that we can complete. We're not going to do any of those just yet. All we're going to do is go back and take a look at our rocket one last time. Now, I want to do one thing just to demonstrate before we wrap up. I'm going to launch this again because I want to show you something that's very important. Our goo experiment. If we observe mystery goo a second time, whoa, look at that. There's almost no reward. The reason is, science experiments have diminishing returns. Some of them, like the crew report, there's nothing new to learn. So if we do repeated crew reports from the launch pad, we're not going to get anything additional out of that. However, if a contract requires you to perform a science experiment like on the launch pad, this will still count towards completing that contract objective, even though we're not getting any additional science from it. Now, the mystery goo, you're going to notice there's that lighter shaded in portion of the green bar and that darker portion. That darker portion is showing us the diminishing returns. So if we do this a third time, we're only going to get that tiny sliver of science. And you can see here it's not even a full point. It's only 0.7. So we'll just take that anyway. We'll grab that. We'll go up and recover our vessel, not even having launched it, and we'll gain our 0.7 science from doing the mystery goo a second time, bringing our total to 22. Okay, so that is about where we're going to wrap up the first episode. Stay tuned to the channel for the second, where we're going to talk a little bit about science progression, biomes, and getting an early jump start without any cheating on our science progression for our career mode save. As always, thanks for watching.